So welcome everyone. It's good to be here with you as we join in this webinar, Pentecost and Beyond, starting with the Pentecost celebration and then looking forward through ordinary time and then focusing particularly on the first few weeks of ordinary time. I'm really excited to share this with you. It's an interesting webinar, a bit different from the others I've done so far in year B, but hopefully we'll give you something to work with through the whole of ordinary time. Will help to put everything in context, and I really hope it's going to be a helpful time. I see Jean and Tom, you're back with us, so glad to see you. So let's jump in, and I'm sure we'll get a few others, and certainly to those of you who are only picking it up on the video who aren't able to make this live event, welcome to you as well, and hope that the video is a really helpful resource for you as well. And of course you'll be able to download this video and download the slides as well. But here we go, let's jump in. I'm going to do a quick overview, which is what I do at the beginning of all of these webinars, just because I'm always aware that there are people who may not have been in any of the previous webinars, and so if this is your first webinar, then you will have missed what really sets the context for everything, which is my approach to worship. And the whole way I interpret the church calendar, the whole way I work with resources and preparing sermons and worship is linked with this understanding of worship, which I refer to as a mystical approach to worship. And what I mean by that is worship as intimacy with God. Now we have to be very careful when we talk about intimacy with God. Famously, some contemporary worship songs have sometimes been referred to as songs that refer to Jesus as my boyfriend. Sometimes we can anthropomorphize God a bit too much. When we speak about intimacy with God, it can become a little too individualistic. There's some things we need to be careful of there. But what I mean when I talk about intimacy with God is really what we find in 2 Corinthians 3:18. And 2 Corinthians 3:18, I encourage you to go back and read it. I'm just going to give you my paraphrase of it, which is loosely based on the first version I learnt this verse from, which was the New International Version, which says, "We who with unveiled faces gaze on God's glory are transformed into God's likeness by the Spirit, who is the Lord, from glory to glory." We gaze, which is in a sense the language of lovers who gaze at each other, who spend time looking into each other's eyes and just taking each other in. We gaze on God's glory like that, knowing that we are also seen by God because we are unveiled. We come without protection, without pretense, vulnerable, open, visible to God. And we who with unveiled faces gaze on God's glory, we are transformed into God's likeness by the work of the Spirit from glory to glory, meaning it doesn't happen instantly, it happens little by little over time. And that's why we come back to worship again and again and again, because we need the ongoing experience of worship to transform us from glory to glory. So that's what I'm thinking of, and I'm reminded of Richard Rohr's words where he says that those who know God, the mystics, they always find that God is a lover, not a tyrant. And so there is this idea, and when we look back at the mystics, they all have this sense of intimacy with God, this experience of God as a lover. And so that's what I'm talking about. And really we can apply that regardless of how we might understand God. We can still experience God and connect with God, with the divine, if you want to use that language rather, as with a lover. So that intimacy. Now, when I talk about intimacy has really three parts. And I like to think of it as, I guess psychologists would use this kind of language: mutual self-disclosure. Mutual self-disclosure. Now what we mean by that is we're disclosing ourselves, that same thing from 2 Corinthians 3:18, where we are open and vulnerable to the person with whom we want intimacy. We are disclosing ourselves. And it's mutual. self-disclosure. So we each do that, and the extent to which we both are willing to disclose ourselves is the extent to which we experience intimacy. And there are three elements to this intimacy. The first is, sorry, I jumped through that a bit quickly. There are three elements: your story, my story, and our story. If I want to be intimate with you, I need to tell you my story, who I am, where I come from, all of those things. I need to listen to you while you tell me your story. And then over time, our stories begin to merge. When you've known somebody a long time, you can't tell your story without including their story in yours, because the two become one, particularly in very intimate relationships. My wife and I have been married close on 40 years. It's 38 years this year. And we've known each other for more than 40 years. And I can't tell my story without referring to Debbie, and she wouldn't be able to tell her story without including me, because our stories have become one. And that's what happens with intimacy. And of course, the telling of stories is not just words, it's not just information. We are storied beings, and so we reach out to one another through stories. We seek a connection with each other through stories. And in that connection, the intimacy happens. And when our stories merge, it's not just the information about us becomes one, but our entire lives, our beings become intertwined. That's what we're trying to do in worship. And when the two become one, we are transformed. We are changed. Intimacy changes us. So we become like God. And the liturgical calendar is designed to help us experience this kind of intimacy with God, to tell our stories, to hear God's story, and for the two stories to merge and become one. That's why I'm such a big fan of the liturgical calendar, because it's designed to do this. If worship is designed to transform us, and I believe it is, then the liturgical calendar is a wonderful tool to help that happen. What does that look like? Well, first of all, in the liturgical calendar, we get God's story. I spoke about your story and my story in terms of person-to-person intimacy. With God, we're talking about God's story. And the liturgical calendar begins with God's story. From Advent Sunday all the way through to Trinity Sunday, we're dealing with God's story, predominantly through the lens of the Christ event. But we do begin in Advent with looking at the big picture, the ultimate consummation of the universe, the image of all things becoming one and whole in Christ, this grand purpose of God. We see it all there. And then we go into incarnation in Advent. We go into God's glory revealed in Christ. We go into the journey through the wilderness and the disciplines and the ways to overcome temptation that Jesus taught us. We go into Christ's passion. We go into the resurrection. We go into the outpouring of the Spirit, and we finish with exploring God as triune. So in all of these ways, we are listening week after week to God's story. And so the liturgical calendar draws us into that story, and we need to listen attentively. Because obviously if we're not paying attention, there's no intimacy happening. And then we get a chance to tell our story. And that's really what ordinary time is. And we're going into ordinary time in just a few weeks, and that's moving from the God story part of the liturgical calendar into the our story part of the liturgical calendar. And I'm going to not say too much more about that because we'll be talking about ordinary time in more detail a bit later. But what I'm trying to say here is that, again, it's us sharing our story both in the ordinary time season, but also in some of the festivals we pick up, which are not necessarily church-based or scripture-based, things like 16 Days of Activism against gender-based violence. We might want to pick up on ecological issues. We might want to pick up on other justice issues through ordinary time. All of these give us an opportunity to tell our story. And we do that openly and honestly. And of course, every Sunday also gives us opportunities to hear God's story and share our story. And then the intimacy comes with the history, which is built by the 3-year cycle, which is built into the lectionary. And of course, you'll know about this. So we have there all these elements of intimacy: God's story, our story, and a history that over time merges God's story and our story, which is miraculous for me. If you read the scriptures, you can see that God does not tell God's story without including the names of so many people. And you can take any one of those people from the scriptures and they would not be able to tell their story without speaking about God, without speaking about Christ. And so we have this history. And as this conversation happens, God's story, our story, history is developed, so that intimacy transforms us. Or to put it another way, as James K.A. Smith says, we become what we love. Richard Rohr says, you become like the God you worship. And this is how it happens in our worship. So let's talk a little bit more in detail. I'm just going to skim over this very quickly. How does this happen? Well, God's story is what I call the festival time of the church calendar. Of course, it starts on Advent Sunday, and it takes us into what is first of all called the cycle of light. And the cycle of light has three sections to it. There's the season of Advent, Advent Sunday, 4 Sundays leading us up to just before Christmas. Christmas then is the second part, and we know that Christmas is not just a single day, but is 12 days, running from Christmas Day to the 5th of January. And then we move into the Epiphany, which is technically just a day. The Epiphany is the 6th of January. It's the feast of remembering the visit of the Magi to the infant Christ. And then we move into the season after the Epiphany, which technically is part of ordinary time, which we'll talk about just now. But more and more churches are viewing Epiphany as a season on its own. And if you go back, you can find it on YouTube, the free version of my Epiphany webinar, where I speak a bit about why I believe it's a great idea to turn Epiphany into a season and to actually talk about the Epiphany season. Even though if you're going to be a liturgical purist, technically Epiphany is ordinary time, and the season is the season after the Epiphany. When we get to the end of that, which finishes with Transfiguration Sunday, we move into the cycle of life, which again has 3 sections to it. It begins with Lent, which of course starts on Ash Wednesday. Then it goes into Holy Week, which is kind of a season within a season, because Holy Week, the first part of it is part of Lent, because Lent only finishes on on Maundy Thursday. After sundown on Maundy Thursday, that's when Lent finishes, and we move into what is known as the Triduum, the 3 days, and then those 3 days are the bridge between Lent and Easter, which happens then on Easter Sunday, the end of Holy Week. But Holy Week, I like to use Holy Week as a season of its own, because it helps us, I think, to move into the mystery of the Passion of Christ in a deeper way. And of course, Holy Week then leads us into the Easter season, which finishes on Pentecost Sunday. And so Pentecost, while it's a little different, is part of the Easter season. And again, I like to take some liberties with the liturgical calendar, as you'll see a bit later in this webinar, because I like to turn Pentecost into a season as well, a season of spirit that leads us into ordinary time. And I'll talk a bit more about why I like to do that a bit later. So that's the first half, give or take, of the year. Then we move into the Our Story time, which is ordinary time, which is the focus of what we're going to talk about tonight. And ordinary time is the time where we apply the message and mission of Christ that we've been exploring through the festival time. We apply it to our lives and to our world. And ordinary time is meant to be a season of intentional discipleship built on the foundation of the story of Christ, the story of salvation, the story of God's work with humanity that we have been meditating on deeply through the cycle of light and the cycle of life. And so that's what we're doing in ordinary time. Then, of course, ordinary time is focused, because it's about application and discipleship, it's focused on living by the values and priorities of God's reign, the values of justice and love. I've taken to using a bit of alliteration and talking about the principles, priorities, purposes, and practices of God's reign. That's what we focus on during this time of ordinary time. But essentially, it's about manifesting God's reign, embodying the values of justice and love in our lives as followers of Christ, so that God's reign can be made visible among us. And of course, Ordinary Time ends with the Reign of Christ Sunday, which is the Sunday before Advent Sunday, which then starts the next year. So that's the Ordinary Time side. So we've got God's story, we've got our story. Then there's the history, which happens with the 3-year cycle. And we know this in the lectionary, that we run through 3 years. Each one focuses on a particular gospel. So year A is the Gospel of Matthew and John. John doesn't have his own year, but the Gospel of John features in all 3 years, and particularly, as we'll see, in the year of Mark. There's quite a lot of John happening. For example, in the Easter season, John figures very prominently. You may have been aware of that if you're following the lectionary gospel readings. So year A, Matthew and John, that was last year. Next year is year C, Luke and John. This year is year B, Mark and John. And I love this year. I always talk about this in these webinars, because we know Mark's gospel is practical, urgent, to the point, very short gospel, very, and then this happened, and then this happened, action-centered, some teaching, but very practical. John's gospel is mystical, lots of mystery, lots of metaphor, lots of image. John doesn't have miracles, he has signs, words like life and belief and light and darkness and seeing and being blind. These concepts, these ideas feature throughout John's gospel, and so very different from the others. But what you get in year B, which is a little different from the other two, is Mark's practicality, Mark's very embodied gospel, and John's mysticism coming together. And so we have a unique way in year B of integrating body, mind, and heart, which makes year B for me an exciting year. And in that, we are able to build up this history, because we've got these 3 years going through the Gospels over and over. And of course, with each one, there are readings from the epistles or from Acts. There are readings from the Hebrew scriptures, and of course, there are Psalms. And so that gives you a whole range of ways you can approach this 3-year cycle. You could turn it into a 12-year cycle, really, if you want to, because there are at least 4 readings you could use on any given Sunday. And what that means is that there's this richness to keep going deeper in this mystical journey, this journey of intimacy with God, and developing this union where God's story and our story becomes one, and we get transformed by that intimacy with God. So having laid that foundation, let's move on, and we're going to take a look at Ordinary Time itself. And what is the season about? Obviously, it's very different from what's come before, because Advent, Christmas, the Epiphany season, or the season after the Epiphany, if you like, Lent, Holy Week, Easter, all of these seasons have had very clear directions. They're focused on, they're rooted in the story of Christ's life and ministry, Christ's passion, Christ's resurrection. Now, Ordinary Time turns the attention on us, and that makes it a little more open-ended on one level, but it also means everything's going to feel different now, because instead of being witnesses to Christ's life, we now become those who are self-reflective, exploring our lives in the light of the life of Christ. And that makes Ordinary Time an extended season of discipleship. Now, technically, Ordinary Time is split into 2 parts. And when you put them together, it's either 33 weeks or sometimes it's 34 weeks. Whether it's 33 or 34 weeks depends on when Advent of the next year starts. If Advent begins in November, usually the last Sunday in November, then Ordinary Time will total 34 weeks in that year. If Advent begins in December, Ordinary Time will be 34 weeks. So this year, Advent is on the 1st of December, which means that just it falls into December. And so as far as I'm aware, that would mean that ordinary time this year will total 34 weeks when we put the two parts together. Now, the first part of ordinary time we've mentioned before, that's the season after the Epiphany. So it starts after the Epiphany and it runs through to Shrove Tuesday, the Tuesday before Ash Wednesday. The shortest that can be is 4 Sundays. The longest that can be is 9 Sundays. Of course, the length of that season after the Epiphany changes because Easter is not a fixed date every year. It changes every year. And so depending on when Easter is, and that can range, the range between the earliest time in the year and the latest time in the year when Easter can happen is quite extensive. As you can see, at least 5 weeks difference. So depending on when Easter is will depend on how long this season after the Epiphany is. And technically that becomes ordinary time. Not directly after the Epiphany. The Epiphany is on the 6th of January. The first Sunday after the Epiphany is the baptism of Christ. And then ordinary time officially starts after the first Sunday after the Epiphany. But a lot of people count it in this season when we're talking about that as ordinary time. The second time is what we're talking about now. We're talking about the second part of ordinary time, which starts on Trinity Sunday, although I believe some churches kind of almost include Trinity into not so much into Easter, but as its sort of own thing. And then they'll refer to ordinary time as the Sundays after Trinity, whereas other churches will refer to them as the Sundays after Pentecost. But technically, in my tradition anyway, Trinity begins ordinary time, and it runs through to the reign of Christ. And that can run from 23 to 28 weeks, depending on how long that season after the Epiphany is. So that gives you a sense of how things move around and what's going on in ordinary time. Just a small note here, that sometimes the weeks in this section of ordinary time are referred to as proper. So you'll see me when I'm going through the first few weeks, I'll refer to proper 4b, proper 5b, as opposed to Pentecost 1b, Pentecost 2b, for the weeks after Pentecost. And that links largely in the Anglo-Catholic traditions to two ways that the church calendar is viewed, two lenses, if you like. The proper of time, which focuses on the fixed and movable dates in the church calendar, like Christmas and Easter. And then there's the proper of the saints, which focuses on the fixed dates related to the various saints. And so they're called propers because they are dealing with that period in the church calendar where we're looking at some of those things. And you get propers obviously earlier than ordinary time as well, which is why we're starting ordinary time now on proper 4. The Sunday after Trinity is proper 4. The focus, of course, in this time, as we've mentioned, is on deepening our discipleship and living Jesus's message and mission. And there are a few festivals that are included. From a church perspective, All Saints happens later in the year. All Souls, of course, Halloween is linked with that. All Hallows Eve and Thanksgiving also falls into the latter part of ordinary time. But there are lots of other festivals that get drawn into this time of the year because they're relevant to our journey of following Christ and embodying the love and justice of God. So many communities will observe things like the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. Lots of churches will celebrate harvest festivals. Many churches will draw on local or community events or festivals that are in their church or any particular justice issues that arise and are celebrated in that time are often brought into our worship. And I believe that's as it should be. I think that's a great thing for us to do when we're talking about embodying the love and justice of Christ. Of course, that makes it a long season, though. 23 to 28 weeks, roughly 6 months or so. It's a long season. And that means that it can be split up. And I often recommend doing that. I think it's a good idea to create these segments in ordinary time I think for a congregation, it gives a better sense that it's not just this long thing stretching out to where they can't see the end of it, but rather they do these little journeys that can help them grasp a set of truths and then move into the next journey and grasp a set of truths and then move into the next one. And that's one of the reasons why I particularly like to focus on a season of spirit at the beginning of ordinary time. It creates the first section, if you like, and it creates a bit of a bridge. For World AIDS Day, I see, Wendy, you're mentioning. Yes, wonderful thing to include in our worship. That's a great suggestion. Thank you. The season of spirit, we launch it on Pentecost because obviously Pentecost is when we celebrate the Pentecost event. And then Pentecost becomes the bridge between Easter and ordinary time. It feeds into Trinity Sunday as well, which I think is a great thing to do in that season. And then I give it another 4 weeks, so it makes a 6-week season in total, a season of spirit. And there are a couple of reasons why I do that, but I'm going to just pause that and talk about that a little later. But it's a really helpful thing, I think, to do that. And then I normally add at least another 2 segments, or I try to, in terms of the resources I create and the way I deal with things in churches. One is, it's lovely, and many churches do this, to have a season of creation where we focus particularly on climate issues. That's such a big justice issue in our world at the moment. So it's good to have a season where we can focus on that. And I'll be looking at creating a guide for that, which will come out later in the year. And then, because we've got things like All Saints and All Souls and Halloween, which are really about remembrance, and then Thanksgiving just before Advent, which is about giving thanks, those 2 things can come together really nicely. And it's nice to sort of wrap up ordinary time with a season of remembrance and thanksgiving. And so I'm planning to, it'll be my first time this year, to release a resource built around that season. So you can look out for that in a few months' time. And then obviously you have other weeks where, if you like, you can do smaller things or have standalone Sundays or create your own series if you want to. But it's nice to create some variety and look at a number of themes that are relevant to how we follow the message and mission of Christ in our own lives. So with that in mind, how do the readings work in ordinary time? And you probably know this, but let me just run through this with you. In ordinary time, we get 2 sets of readings, and that starts from the Sunday after Trinity Sunday. For the first time, we now get 2 sets of readings, and you'll notice that it's only related to the readings from the Hebrew Scriptures and the Psalms, which obviously are part of the Hebrew Scriptures, but you understand what I'm saying. And so there are 2 Psalms, you choose between them, and 2 readings from the Hebrew Scriptures, and you choose which of those you're going to have. And that's to give you 2 different approaches to the lectionary through ordinary time. And there are a bunch of reasons why that is valuable for us. So let's quickly take a look at this. But I want you to keep in mind, just before I jump in there, that the point of having a gospel that guides the year is not that you always have to read the gospel in your worship services. It's that the voice of the gospel influences whatever you read for that year. So you may decide to focus on the readings from the Hebrew Scriptures for a series, but you can still approach them through the eyes of Mark, if you like. So for example, when I did the Easter webinar, I was talking about how Easter in year B, the gospel readings are pretty much all from John's gospel. But because it's year B, we are reading John through Mark's eyes. And that influences how we're going to interact with the readings from John. That continues through ordinary time with all the readings that we have, whichever ones we decide to follow. And it's often a good time, I know, a good opportunity, a lot of churches do this, to maybe spend some of ordinary time focusing on the Hebrew Scriptures, some of ordinary time focusing on the epistles, and some of ordinary time focusing on the gospel readings. And you'll see when I go through these readings that there's quite a nice little window in the middle of ordinary time in year B that can give quite a nice little gospel focus if you want to do that. I'll talk about that just now. So that's why there are two sets of readings, because it gives you all of these creative possibilities. So what are they? You'll know this. The first set is what is known as the semi-continuous readings, and that focuses on the Hebrew Bible. The idea is to give a kind of narrative journey through the Hebrew Scriptures through the 3 years of the lectionary. So year A focuses on the patriarchs, starting in Genesis, and on the Exodus. And those will be the readings that you'll focus on in year A if you're reading the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures. And then you will have a psalm that links with that reading from the Hebrew Scriptures. So the psalm and that Old Testament reading link together, and they journey through ordinary time together, the psalms and the semi-continuous reading, if that's what you choose to follow. In year B, the monarchy is the focus. And of course, we're in year B, so I want to just take a little bit more time with this. This year, at the beginning of ordinary time, we start with Samuel. And Samuel coming into Eli's home, hearing the voice of God, his journey to becoming a judge over Israel. And then, of course, from Samuel we get the appointment of Saul as king, David taking over as king, and it runs us all the way through to Solomon's dedication of the temple. So that's the journey through ordinary time in terms of the monarchy. But thrown into that, and not always in sections, but you do get some interesting sections that could also be some quite interesting shorter series, if you'd like to use them that way, is some readings from the wisdom literature, from Proverbs and from Joel. And sorry, not Joel, I've put Joel on the screen, but actually it's supposed to be Job. Sorry, I was putting this together fairly quickly today, so just make a note of that. It's Proverbs and Job, not Joel. Joel, of course, is one of the prophets. And then some of the history from Esther and Ruth, although Esther and Ruth also sometimes fall into kind of like wisdom literature, sort of, in our thinking, because they're a little different from the other historical books. So that's year B, the semi-continuous readings give us those options, and again some lovely creative opportunities for preaching and worship. And then year C, which obviously we move into next year, which is the Gospel of Luke, is the focus. And in the semi-continuous readings, the focus is on the prophets, which I think is really appropriate with Luke, because he particularly has this very earthy, justice-oriented focus to his gospel, the inclusion of women, and of course the focus of the Spirit as well in his gospel. The other readings then are different from these, and they're called the complementary readings, because in the complementary readings the Gospels remain the focus, and the other readings are all linked to the Gospels. So the readings from the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament readings, are linked with the Gospel readings. And then the Psalm still links with the Old Testament reading, but of course, because the Old Testament reading is linking with the Gospel, there's also this link into the Gospel as well, even with the Psalms. So even though you may not be reading the Gospel, there's a much more clear Gospel focus if you use the complementary readings. Now, generally, you will stick with one or the other. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that just now, because to borrow a term from a friend of mine, Christine Sine, who some of you may know, I'm also a little bit of a liturgical rebel. Christine started a podcast a few weeks back called the Liturgical Rebel Podcast. And I really advise you to track it down. I encourage you to do that. It's a great podcast, some wonderful interviews with some great people. So track it down, take a listen to that. Really helpful stuff happening there. And Liturgical Rebel, I think I'd like to borrow that descriptor for me as well. But before we get there, the complementary readings are all going to focus around the Gospels in ordinary time. And the first few weeks, we're looking at Mark's Gospel, of course, because that's the Gospel of the year, from chapter 2 to chapter 6. And that takes a few weeks right through. Then we get a break in the middle of ordinary time this year, where the focus for a number of weeks, I think it's 4 weeks, the focus is on John 6. And of course, John 6, if I remember correctly, is Jesus's teaching, I'm the bread of life. And he goes into a whole bread of life narrative. And unless you eat my body and drink my blood, you won't know about the kingdom of God. All of those things that Jesus said, people left him because of what he was saying, linked with the feeding of the 5,000, all of that context around John's gospel happens. And so you have this opportunity to jump into the bread of life as a sermon series in the middle of ordinary time this year, if you would like to. And then we return to Mark after that, and we go from Mark chapter 7 all the way through to Mark 13. Obviously, we don't go further than that because then we're moving into the Passion narrative, and we've already dealt with the Passion this year, except for one exception, and that is that the very last week of ordinary time, the celebration of the reign of Christ, we look at John 18 from verse 33 to verse 37. And that, of course, is the reading where Jesus is being interviewed by Pilate. He's on trial before Pilate. Pilate says, so you're the king of the Jews? And Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. And of course, that's an important thing to remember when we celebrate the reign of Christ as we bring year B to an end. And so that's the journey. I haven't given you all the other readings because we just wouldn't have time, and it just gets too complicated to go through all the other readings. But everything that happens in ordinary time, in the complementary readings, are going to link with these gospel readings. Mark 2 to 6, John 6, Mark 7 to 13, and then that section from John 18. So that's the idea, is that you would be, in terms of, if you were a liturgical and lectionary purist, you would choose that for ordinary time this year, for the entirety of ordinary time, I'm focusing on the semi-continuous readings, or for the entirety of ordinary time, I'm focusing on the complementary readings. And the idea would be that you don't jump from one to the other. Now, I suspect that most churches do. As they're working with the lectionary, they probably look at what's going to speak into their community best. Personally, I don't think that's going to send you to hell. I'm not going to argue with you if you decide to do that. I think it can be helpful. I also know that generally it's frowned upon to look at all the readings together. Obviously, it's a lot of work to do that, and they are meant to be two separate approaches to the lectionary. And so the idea is not to bring them together, but to focus on one or the other, even if you do it in sections. And for a few weeks you focus on semi-continuous, and a few weeks you focus on the complementary readings. Even then, you would focus on one or the other for that period. I have to be honest, though, I quite enjoy using all the readings, at least in my thinking around the theme of a week. And if you are at all familiar with my lectionary resources that you can find on my website, sacredeyes.com, you'll know that that's what I do, partly because it's easier. Instead of doing two sets of lectionary resources through ordinary time, I do the one, and I try to take all the readings into account and find what the themes are that come through all of them, and then see if I can pull that together into a single theme. Judging by the fact that people still use those resources, I'm taking that as a sign that people find that helpful. But if you find it easier to focus on one or the other, of course you're welcome to do that. I love the creativity that is available to us when we look at ordinary time and we work with the different readings. So for me, I'm in the favor of freedom and using these readings in whatever way works for your community. But just be aware of this is how they're intended, and this is how they work. So for the last few minutes of our time together, I want to spend a little bit more time focusing on the beginning of ordinary time, on how we enter into this extended season. Because I will be doing webinars later in the year around a season of creation and one around that season of thanksgiving and remembrance. So there will be another two happening a bit later in the year. But for me, it's really important when we realize that this ordinary time, this extended season, it's such a long season, and it's about discipleship. It's about following Christ. For me, how we start the season is important. I'm just going to pause quickly and say to Maggie, thank you. I'm glad you're finding this helpful. Yes, the recording will be available to review. I normally try and get it out within a day or two of the actual live webinar. So I'm hoping to get it out tomorrow. If not, certainly by early next week at the latest, it'll be available. You will get an email notifying you when it's available on the replay page of my site. And there will be a button to download the video. I know for some people, particularly if you want to share it with your ministry team or with your congregation, it's difficult to rely on an internet connection when you're trying to get a group of people together. So I make the video available for download. I will also post it on YouTube, where it'll be available for free for whoever wants to see it. But that isn't downloadable unless you know how to hack the system. And also, the replay page will have access to my slides in a PDF form that you can download as well. So you're welcome to get that, and that'll be available very soon. But so to come back to ordinary time, we're going into a season of discipleship, a season of seeking to follow Christ and embody the values and priorities of God's reign. So for me, it's really important that we spend time preparing well for that, but also recognizing that the gift of the Spirit is there for that reason. You know, when Jesus told his disciples to wait in Jerusalem until the Spirit should come, until they have this new awareness of Spirit, he said, because then you will be my witnesses. The Spirit will empower you to do the work that I have done. And greater work, Jesus said in John 14. The Spirit will empower you to be my witnesses. You will go out there and live by these values and priorities. You will embody the reign of God, because the same Spirit that is in me will be in you, and you will become little incarnations. And so I think it's really important that we take time to acknowledge that, to open ourselves to the Spirit, and to review what the Spirit brings that enables us to follow Christ more effectively and embody the message and mission of Jesus. And so with that in mind, I've created a new liturgical and devotional guide for the 6 weeks, starting on Pentecost Sunday and running through to proper 7B. And it's called Spirited, Living a Spirit-Regulated Life. I'm really excited about this resource. It's 6 weeks, so it gives you a good amount of time to engage with Spirit-filled living or Spirit-regulated living, which means that the focus is not only on the Spirit, but rather on what it means for us to live in the Spirit, if I can use that language. And part of what I'm doing in this guide is to I guess kind of reinterpret, maybe deconstruct and reconstruct the language of living in the Spirit. I think that's often been viewed in a kind of charismatic Pentecostal way. It's often been viewed as the Spirit is out there and comes into us. The Spirit is above and is sent to us. And then we now have the Spirit, but we can lose the Spirit. The Spirit is in some places and not in others. What I'm really trying to do with this guide is to explore the Spirit who is always and has always been within us, among us, around us, from the moment of creation where the Spirit hovered over creation. Throughout, we see the Spirit active and working within and around and with God's people. And speaking about what it means for Pentecost to be about an awareness and appropriation of that and living that out, and how that helps us to be little incarnations. And so what does it mean to live in the Spirit from a progressive point of view? How do we transition strongly into the deepening discipleship of ordinary time? And how can we give a bit more emphasis to the Spirit? Because we spend all this time focusing on the life and work of Christ, and obviously we see God the parent involved in Christ's life in so many ways. But then we have Pentecost, and often, although we can see the Spirit operating in the life of Christ, that's not always a clear focus in the earlier part of the year. So I think it can be really helpful for us to have a strong Spirit focus as we go into ordinary time. And of course, this guide, Spirited, Living a Spirit-Regulated Life, it's based on the Gospel readings for Year B from the Revised Common Lectionary. And I hope you'll allow me to take just a few more minutes just to run through the chapters so you can get a sense of what this guide is doing for you. First of all, Pentecost Sunday, the title of the chapter is Advocate. It's based not on the Acts 2 reading. Of course, you're welcome to use the Acts 2 reading in your worship, but it's based on the reading from John's Gospel. John 15, 26 to 27, and John 16, 4b to 15, where Jesus promises the Spirit as the advocate, where he speaks about how he's going to go away, and he needs to go away so that his disciples could experience the advocate. And what we're really exploring in this chapter is that Pentecost is not about an absent Spirit becoming present. It's about unaware human beings becoming aware of the Spirit's presence within us, among us, and around us. And it's learning that there is nowhere we can go that God's Spirit cannot reach us. And it's becoming in ourselves little incarnations who embody the divine life and being in our own frail humanity. And it talks about how we can do that. What does that look like for us? That's followed, of course, on Trinity Sunday with a chapter that's called Mystery. Because, I mean, I was taught even as far back as when I was studying theology that the Trinity is a mystery. But I'm not using it in quite that way. The reading is from John 3. John 3, 1 to 17 begins with Nicodemus's visit to Jesus in the night and the whole born-again narrative. And then, of course, John 3, 16, for God so loved the world that he gave God's one and only Son. We know that verse so well. And then the Son did not come into the world to judge the world, but so that the world through him could be saved. And so in this chapter, we're exploring what might be possible if we allowed ourselves and one another to embrace the concept of Trinity as a doorway into mystery. Imagine what might happen if we were to accept God's invitation to follow the unpredictable impulses of Spirit, the Spirit who in John 3 blows like the wind. If we followed the impulses of that Spirit into a more grounded and calm experience of life, a more open and accepting approach to relationships, and a more resilient capacity to navigate the unpredictability of our world. And I talk about how in a world that is uncertain and unpredictable, we often try to nail God down and make God certain and predictable. But that backfires on us because then we're not prepared to deal with the unpredictability of the world. And so I'm suggesting that when we allow the concept of Trinity not to be a way to nail God down and define God in terms of three persons, but rather as an archetype, as a metaphor, as an image, as a symbol, if you like, that draws us into the mystery of God, into the God who cannot be defined, then being comfortable with this God, this unpredictable, undefinable God, that enables us to be more comfortable with the unpredictability in our world. I think it's a fun chapter that I really enjoyed writing it. Then we move into proper 4b. We're now in ordinary time proper, no pun intended. And the first week we're back in Mark is on this week. And it's Mark 4 from verse 2, Mark 2 from verse 23 to Mark 3 verse 6. Mark 2:23 to Mark 3 verse 6. And it's an interesting passage because there are two stories of Jesus breaking the Sabbath law from the perspective of the Pharisees. The one is when his disciples are walking through the wheat field and they're picking grain and eating it. And the other one is where Jesus heals a man with a withered arm on the Sabbath. Both of those things happen on the Sabbath. In both cases, the Pharisees point accusing fingers at Jesus and ask why he allows this. And it's really about Jesus crossing lines. I've called it improv because I talk about how Jesus said, I didn't come to do away with the law, but to fulfill the law. But sometimes his fulfilling of the law kind of looks like breaking it. It looks like he's playing a bit fast and loose with it. But what I'm suggesting is that he uses the law as a foundation, but then he improvises. Because what Jesus is fulfilling is not the letter of the law, but the spirit of it. And that's why he says the Sabbath was created for humanity, not humanity for the Sabbath. And I think you could extend that to say the law was created for humanity, not humanity for the law. And so when Jesus crossed lines, he did it thoughtfully, purposely, and for the sake of people in need. It was always selfless, it was always generous. And that's the way of the Spirit. The unpredictable wind-like Spirit crosses lines and improvises easily, without shame or doubt, but always in service of humanity, always for the sake of the greater good. And the Spirit invites us into this improvisational way of life that Jesus demonstrates for us. We follow that up with an interesting chapter. I think perhaps one of the most important chapters I've written in anything that I've done, particularly in terms of its relevance to what's going on in the world right now. Proper 5b, the chapter's called Unforgivable with a question mark because it's based on Mark 3, verse 20 to 35, where Jesus speaks about the unforgivable sin. In that little section of Mark's Gospel, Jesus is being accused of having power to cast out demons from the devil, that the power he uses is the power of the evil one. And Jesus, of course, speaks about how that's absurd because then a kingdom would be divided against itself. It can't possibly be that, but rather it's the power of God that is among you. And then he speaks about the one sin that cannot be forgiven is blasphemy against the Spirit or insulting the Spirit. And I interpret that in the light of what happens before Jesus says that, which is where he is doing the will of God, he is doing good, and it's being interpreted by the religious leaders as evil. And so they are getting good and evil confused. And so one of the qualities we most need in our world today is the ability to discern the difference between good and evil. When the things we view as good are denounced as evil, and the things we know are evil are celebrated as good, can you think of anywhere where that's happening in our world right now? I can think of a few places. When that happens, our society breaks down to a devastating extent. And that's why we need those who embrace the way of the Spirit, who can see evil clearly, who will stand up for good bravely, and who will cut through the lies and the corruption. And that's what we are called to do as we live the Spirit-regulated life, to be those who can discern clearly in the Spirit's power between good and evil and speak up for good and speak against what is evil. Linked with those two chapters, the improvisational way of Christ, the unforgivable sin, in inverted commas, is unstoppable. By the way, the thing of the unforgivable sin is not that it's technically unforgivable, but that when you've got good and evil confused, it's very hard to find your way back, because when you see good as evil, you're not going to go there. And I think that's what Jesus is talking about when he speaks about it being unforgivable in that language. Proper 6 then is unstoppable. Two parables of the reign of God that both include seeds. The one is about the farmer who plants a seed and the seed grows and he doesn't know how. And the second one is the famous mustard seed parable that grows into a large tree in which the birds can make their homes. And it speaks about how God's reign is present and at work within us and among us. The reign of God cannot be stopped, hence the chapter name, Unstoppable. It cannot be destroyed. Wherever love and justice are manifest, God's reign is present. But we don't always see it, and we can't control it. All we can do is notice and participate, and then allow the Spirit to transform us into people who embody God's reign in our thoughts, relationships, and actions. And then the last chapter, chapter 7b, is entitled Calm. Mark 4, proper 7b, Mark 4 from verse 35 to verse 41. Calm is there because it's the story of Jesus calming the storm. He and his disciples are on the boat. They're going out into the sea. Jesus is asleep in the back, massive wind comes up, which is really dangerous, of course, on the Sea of Galilee. They wake Jesus up in fear. He stills the storm, and he says to them, why were you afraid? Do you not have faith? And I kind of look at that story a little differently. I wonder if Jesus didn't have a twinkle in his eye, whether rather than being a reprimand, it was actually him just having fun with them, teasing them a little, because he knew that he had just taught them to have more faith. He had taught them a different kind of faith, a faith that, yes, stills the storm, but not necessarily by stilling the storm out there, but by stilling the storm within us. And so God's rain will help us to overcome the storms that we all must face. The Spirit leads us through them. We have the presence and resources of the Spirit to strengthen and guide us. We have relationships to comfort and support us. And we have the gift of faith that can help us find a center of calm, even in our storms. And as we embrace these gifts, we discover the goodness of living by the Spirit's rhythms and wisdom. All of these chapters come in the liturgical guide with sermon starters, reflections, all your prayers and liturgies that you need, including a communion liturgy, a table liturgy that you can use at any service in the series, graphics for your sermon titles, for your sermon notes, for lyrics and liturgies, for the words to go up on screen, and rituals and meditations for the gathering of the congregation, for the response moment, and for an integration moment as you send people out. The devotional guide, which is sold separately. All the two can be bought as a bundle. The devotional guide includes reflections, which are linked with the sermon that people will have heard if they're in your services. They also have a printout of the same chapter from the liturgical guide. There are daily spiritual practices, and then also reflection questions for every day of the series, where people can wrestle with the scriptures and apply it to their own lives. This resource launched on Tuesday. You may already have seen those emails. So people have already started responding. We've had a few sales already. I'm really excited about this guide. I think it's a great way to start off the Pentecost season. I hope this has been helpful for you. Thank you for being here, or if you're watching the recording, thank you for watching. I hope this will help you enter ordinary time with a new energy, a new enthusiasm, and that it will give you a bit of inspiration to keep the energy up a little. I know it's a time of rest. I know particularly in the Northern Hemisphere it's a time of holiday, but I hope it'll help you keep the energy up so that we can do the work of ordinary time, the work of discipleship, the work of learning to embody God's reign in our own lives. Just one last chance if there are any questions. Jeanette, looking forward to using Spirit to thank you. Like this idea. Thank you, Molly. Thank you, Eric. So glad that you found this helpful. So have a wonderful ordinary time. There are a few more weeks left. Ascension Day just around the corner. It'll be this time next week. I hope you have a great time with Ascension Day, and of course then with Pentecost and the season beyond. Thank you so much for being here, and look forward to seeing you at the next webinar, which will be in a few months' time. Thanks, everybody. And of course, you can email me if you have any other questions or comments or anything more you need to know about this new guide. So I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you so much. Good night, everybody.